if we're on the verge of a global liquidity crisis, as revealed by the Eurodollar futures curve and the Treasury yield curve, and negative swap spreads and Treasury bill auctions with the yield to maturity below what the Fed will give you for a phone call. I mean, all those things are happening. That's hard data. And it's a very, very troubling sign, last seen in 2008, by the way, before the Lehman Brothers meltdown. If all that's happening and the fundamental signs are also weak, which we just saw in third quarter GDP, which is based on net exports, which won't last. How are you going to drive a trade surplus with the strongest dollar in 20 years? Good luck with that. I mean, nobody can afford our stuff, and we're not buying anybody else's stuff. So with the economy going into a recession on its own, with a global liquidity crisis brewing, why on earth is the Fed raising rates at all? But I found some really, really interesting research that, because everyone says, well, yeah, COVID messed it up and the war in Ukraine messed it up. Well, that's true, but it didn't start there. This started in 2018 with Trump's tariffs. The US and Brazil are the two largest exporters of soybeans. China is the world's largest importer of soybeans. China was buying all their soybeans from the United States just as a way to kind of make it up a little bit. Like, well, we got to buy the soybeans anyway. Why not buy them from the US to keep the US-China trade deficit under control so it doesn't become too politically toxic? Well, as soon as Trump threw on the tariffs, China retaliated by moving their soybean orders to Brazil. Stop buying U.S. soybeans. Well, that's not a phone call. I mean, you're talking about vessels, port facilities, agriculture, trucks. How do you get the soybeans to the ports? How many do you grow? Where's the fertilizer coming from? Et cetera, et cetera. And all those parties, the shippers, the cargo, the insurance companies, there's so many people involved, banks, letters of credit, it's just a lot involved. They don't like short-term relationships. They say, okay, I'll do it. I want a 5-year contract. And China said, okay. So they reconfigured all those transportation lanes to get the soybeans from Brazil. All of a sudden, you're a U.S. soybean grower. You say, well, what do? Well, we start selling them to the Netherlands because the Netherlands needs soybeans too. So now instead of shipping them from like Port of LA to Ningbo and near Shanghai, we're shipping them from Port of Houston to, I don't know, France, and Marseille or someplace, or Rotterdam. So the point being, you completely scrambled all these supply chain relationships. Economic growth is weak. We're in a recession. I don't care what Janet Yellen says. I don't consider her expert on the topic, but we've had our 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. Like it or not, that's the definition of recession. The fact that the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a private group, by the way, but they're the recognized referees on recessions and recoveries, the fact that they haven't said so doesn't mean anything, because they never do say so until 9 months or a year after it happened. And for that matter, most recessions are 2 quarters, some 3, some have been longer, but most recessions are a couple of quarters. The National Bureau of Economic Research usually declares a recession after it's already over. Like, it started, it happened, it's over, we're in recovery. And they go, oh, by the way, we had a recession last January. Debt to GDP sky high, economy weak at best, probably had a recession in the first half. Maybe that's continuing. People talk unemployment close to an all-time low. Yeah, but even at 3.5% or so, that is extremely low. I mean, I go back to the 1960s, and that was low by the measures of the 1960s. But that completely ignores probably 8 to 10 million Americans who were perfectly able of having jobs and working. Prime age 25 to 54 years old. It's never 100. I mean, there's always, you could be a homemaker, a student, they're retired, early retirees. There are a lot of reasons people aren't in the workforce, but not taking 10% off, a 14% decline from the starting place in over 20 years. That's so if you throw those people into they're not called unemployed because they're not looking for jobs, but if you threw them in, unemployment would be closer to 10%, which is a recession or depression level, actually. The baseline deficit is $1 trillion. So your deficit's out of control and your trade deficit's out of control. I don't want to overuse metaphors, but one metaphor is you have a very beautiful, expensive vase and somebody knocks it over and it breaks into 5,000 pieces. You can't put the vase back together. You've got to go get a new one. And that's what's happened with the supply chain. What I call supply chain 1.0 from 1989 to 2019. is broken, there will be a new supply chain. There always are. Supply chains have been around since the Bronze Age, if not earlier. But the new supply chain, what I call supply chain 2.0, will look very different than the old supply chain. Right now, we're in an in-between period where things don't work well. Again, it doesn't mean total chaos, but you still see shortages, you still see higher prices, which are coming from supply chain disruptions. And these things are not easy to fix, but they can be replaced, and that's what I expect to happen. We'll hear from them at some point, but we're in a recession now, and people say, what about the third quarter? And it's interesting because I do put some weight on the Atlanta Fed GDP now. I do think it's a very good tool. They miss sometimes, they're not always accurate, but it's the best tool out there. But very few people understand their statistical technique. Because what Wall Street does, you get a whole bunch of components for GDP, and they come in at different times with different lags, and you add them all up and you get GDP. And what Wall Street does, they look at what they have and they project all the rest based on regressions and correlations, which don't necessarily hold up. But here's what we think. Here's our forecast for third quarter GDP based on projections of what we don't know. Atlanta doesn't do that. Atlanta takes what we do know, hard data, and they ask a different question. They say, what would GDP be now if this was all we had? And they put out a number. But they don't guess at the stuff they don't have. And it fills in as it goes along. So it's much more Bayesian in that sense. But because of how the data comes out, the time sequence to which the data comes out, it typically fades as the quarter goes on. It's not because they're using bad methodology. It's just because that's how they do it. And so just in the last week, 9 days or so, it went, everyone was cheering. I think with September 1st, it was 2.3%, maybe a little higher, but about 2.3%. 2 days later, it was 1.6, and now it's down to 1.3. Around November 2021, you'll recall there were headlines, bare shelves, empty shelves, supply chain breakdown, Christmas will be canceled, etc. And it was all true. You went to the supermarket. It didn't mean that every shelf was completely bare, like East Germany in the 1950s. But there were paper goods might not be there, or maybe your favorite kind of tomato sauce, or chicken, or whatever it was. There were some things there, but a lot of things weren't there, and that got worse. And then of course gas prices skyrocket because of basically because of a lot of bad policy from the United States in terms of Keystone Pipeline and a lot of other factors. That then